May 5th, 1821. Longwood House, Island of St. Helena. The air in the room is a crushing weight, thick with the smell of damp wood, stale medicine, and the finality of death. Rain, driven by the relentless Atlantic wind, lashes against the windows of this gilded cage, a sound like weeping. Inside, the world has shrunk to the confines of a single bed. Here lies the shell of a man who once bestrode continents, a fallen titan chained to a rock in the middle of nowhere. His breath is a shallow, rasping struggle, each inhalation a battle, each exhalation a surrender. The faces around him, doctors, generals, companions in exile, are blurred masks of grief and impotence. They lean in, straining to catch the last pronouncements of the man who redrew the map of Europe. They expect a final strategic command, a damning verdict on his enemies, a grand philosophical statement on the nature of power. But the words that force their way past his cracked lips are not of armies, or crowns, or empires. They are a fractured, desperate murmur, a collage of fevered dreams. France. Armée, tête d'armée. France, the army, head of the army. And then, as the last flicker of consciousness gutters and fades, a final, clear whisper cuts through the storm's fury, a sound so soft, yet so profound, it silences the room. Josephine. It is not a cry of regret, but a statement of arrival, a journey's end. The name hangs in the air, an epitaph more telling than any inscription that would be carved in stone. The man who made kings and toppled dynasties, who saw the pyramids and the Kremlin, who possessed everything and lost it all, dies with the name of the woman he himself had cast away on his lips. This single word is the key to the entire epic, the final, heartbreaking piece of a puzzle that tormented him until his last breath. This is the saga of a love that defied an empire, a passion that burned brighter than the flames of Moscow and echoed longer than the cannons of Austerlitz. This is the narrative of Marie-Joseph Rose Tachère de la Pagerie, a Creole aristocrat from a remote sugar island, and Napoleon Bonaparte, the provincial Corsican soldier who would crown himself Emperor of the French. Their story is the ultimate paradox of power. He was a man who bent the will of nations to his own, a political architect and military genius who saw the world as a grand chessboard upon which people were merely pawns. He divorced Josephine with cold, calculated reason, sacrificing his personal happiness for the dynastic security of an heir, an act of supreme imperial logic. And yet, this logical, ruthless master of the world could never complete the transaction. He could remove her from the throne, but he could not remove her from his soul. This forces us to ask the central burning question of their shared history. Why? Why couldn't the man who rejected her ever truly leave her? What was the nature of this indestructible bond that made a woman, 6 years his senior, with 2 children and a tarnished reputation, the one unconquerable territory in Napoleon's vast, emotional landscape? To understand this man, to comprehend how a love could be stronger than an empire, we must return to the world that spawned them both, a world of violent, terrifying, and exhilarating change, where old certainties were being washed away in a torrent of blood and ideology. To understand their personal drama, we must first zoom out to the world stage, a continent convulsing in the throes of a revolutionary fever. The late 18th century was not merely a time of change, it was a detonation. In France, the gilded cage of the Bourbon monarchy had been shattered, and King Louis XVI and his queen, Marie Antoinette, had followed their crumbling dynasty to the guillotine. The ensuing reign of terror was a paranoid bloodbath, a political purification that devoured its own children, where the mere suspicion of aristocratic sympathies was a death sentence. Out of this carnage, a new and aggressive French Republic was born, an ideological force that terrified the ancient monarchies of Europe. From the courts of Vienna, St. Petersburg, and London, the Habsburgs, the Romanovs, and the Hanoverians looked upon France with a mixture of horror and contempt. This republic was a contagion, a radical experiment in liberty, equality, and fraternity that threatened to unravel the entire fabric of their divinely ordained power. They formed coalition after coalition, a wall of steel and tradition in an attempt to crush this revolutionary upstart. It was an age of existential conflict, a clash of civilizations between the old world of kings and the new world of citizens. And it was this perpetual state of war, this crucible of chaos, that created a unique power vacuum. In this new France, birthright meant less than ever before. What mattered now was talent, ruthlessness, and above all, ambition. It was a world where a man of obscure origins, a brilliant artillery officer from the forgotten island of Corsica, could rise through the ranks with breathtaking speed, his ascent fueled by the very chaos the old kings sought to contain. This was the world Napoleon was made for. It was a landscape of titanic forces, and into this inferno stepped a woman whose only weapons were her charm, her intelligence, and an unshakable will to survive. Her story did not begin in the glittering ballrooms of Paris, but thousands of miles away, under the humid, oppressive sun of Martinique. Marie-Joseph Rose Tachère de la Pagerie, the woman history would know as Josephine, was born into the languid, morally ambiguous world of the French colonial aristocracy. It was a life built on the brutal foundation of sugarcane plantations and slavery, a society of decadent planters who lived in a state of splendid isolation from the revolutionary currents sweeping the motherland. She was a Creole, a product of the islands, imbued with a certain superstition's grace and an indolent charm that the women of Paris could never quite replicate. Her world was one of vivid colors, tropical languor, and the constant, unspoken threat of violence. Married off at 16 to the Vicomte Alexandre de Beauharnais, a dashing but callow aristocrat, she was transplanted to the heart of metropolitan France, a world for which she was utterly unprepared. The marriage was a disaster, a cold and loveless union that produced 2 children, Eugène and Hortense, but offered no emotional solace. Then, the revolution erupted, and Josephine's world was not merely shaken, it was annihilated. Her husband, despite his revolutionary fervor, fell victim to the terror's insatiable paranoia. He was dragged to the guillotine, his aristocratic name a death sentence. Josephine herself was thrown into the chilling darkness of Les Carmes prison, the antechamber of death. Every day she heard the rumble of the tumbrils carting her fellow prisoners to their doom. She felt the damp chill of the stone walls, smelled the fear and despair, and waited for her own name to be called. She was saved only by the fall of Robespierre, a stroke of pure, dumb luck that snatched her from the blade's edge. This experience was the crucible that forged her character. She emerged from prison not broken, but remade. The frivolous Creole girl was gone, replaced by a woman of steel, a survivor who understood with terrifying clarity that in this new world, security was a fleeting illusion. She had stared into the abyss, and it had taught her the ultimate lesson. She would do anything, use any tool at her disposal to never be powerless again. Emerging from the shadow of the guillotine into the chaotic, morally bankrupt society of the Directory, Josephine de Beauharnais transformed her very existence into a masterpiece of political and social maneuvering. Paris in the mid-1790s was a city of survivors, a frantic dance on the graves of the fallen. The ideological purity of the early revolution had given way to a cynical, hedonistic scramble for wealth and power. Fortunes were made and lost overnight. The new masters of France were men like Paul Barras, a director of the Republic, a decadent, corrupt, and utterly ruthless politician who embodied the spirit of the age. It was in his orbit that Josephine found her salvation. She became his mistress, a position that was far more than a mere romantic entanglement. In the salons of the Directory, which she quickly came to dominate, a beautiful and intelligent woman was a political asset of the highest order. These gatherings were not just social events. They were the nerve centers of the new republic, places where alliances were forged, conspiracies were hatched, and political fortunes were decided. Josephine, with her innate grace, her carefully cultivated air of aristocratic languor, and the tragic romantic allure of a viscount's widow, became an indispensable player. She was a master of whispers, a gatherer of secrets, a conduit of influence. She could soothe the egos of ambitious generals, charm hostile deputies, and subtly guide conversations to Barras's advantage. She learned to listen, to observe, to understand the intricate web of fears and desires that motivated the powerful men around her. This was her first true step into the great game. She was not a revolutionary, not an ideologue, but a pragmatist of the highest order. Her time in prison had stripped her of any illusions. She was playing a dangerous game in a world run by dangerous men, using her wit and her body as the currency of survival, building a fragile fortress of influence to protect herself and her children from the wolves that circled constantly. Beneath the polished veneer of the charming socialite, the graceful hostess of Paris, lay a core of pure, unadulterated fear. This was Josephine's inner demon, the secret engine that drove her every action. Her entire being was shaped by the trauma of the terror and the gnawing memory of abject poverty. When she was released from Les Carmes prison, she was destitute, a widow with 2 children and a tainted aristocratic name in a republic that had just finished slaughtering aristocrats by the thousand. She had known the sharp pangs of hunger, the humiliation of selling her possessions, the terror of not knowing how she would feed her son and daughter the next day. This memory was a ghost that never left her. Her relentless pursuit of luxury, her legendary extravagance, and a shopping addiction that would later drive Napoleon to distraction was not mere frivolity. It was a desperate, psychological defense mechanism, an attempt to build a wall of beautiful things, dresses from Leroy, exquisite jewels from Chaumet, rare flowers for her gardens at Malmaison, to keep the specter of poverty at bay. Every purchase was an act of defiance against the memory of her squalid prison cell. Her motivation was not greed in the conventional sense. It was a profound, almost pathological need for security. Power, for Josephine, was not an abstract concept. It was a shield, a powerful protector, a wealthy husband, a secure position in society. These were the only things that could guarantee she would never again hear the rumble of the death cart in the street or see the fear in her children's eyes. This deep-seated insecurity explains her choices, from becoming Barras's mistress to her later anxieties as empress. She was a woman haunted by the abyss, and her life became a relentless quest to climb so high that she could never fall back in. Into this world of cynical survivors and calculated alliances strode a force of nature. In 1795, a meeting was arranged in the salon of Paul Barras, a fateful encounter that would alter the course of European history. On one side stood the citizeness de Beauharnais, the epitome of Parisian grace. At 32, she was a woman in full command of her powers, exuding a mature, sophisticated charm that was both alluring and reassuring. She was elegant, witty, and moved through the treacherous social landscape with the effortless confidence of someone who had mastered the rules of the game. On the other side stood General Napoleon di Buonaparte, a 26-year-old soldier who was the very antithesis of her world. He was short, thin, with a sallow complexion and ill-fitting clothes. His French was tinged with a thick, unfashionable Corsican accent. He was socially awkward, intense, and possessed a burning, almost feral ambition that made the jaded dandies of the Directory uncomfortable. He was fire, raw and untamed. She was grace, refined and controlled. According to the legend, their first direct contact came when Josephine's young son, Eugène, came to the general to request the return of his executed father's sword. Bonaparte, moved by the boy's plea, granted the request. The next day, Josephine came to thank him in person. The attraction was immediate and explosive, a classic case of opposites colliding. He, a man who had known only military camps and the company of soldiers, was utterly bewitched by her elegance, her poise, her connection to a world of power and sophistication he longed to conquer. She, in turn, was not so much attracted as intrigued. In this awkward, intense young general, she sensed a terrifying power, a relentless will to succeed that dwarfed that of the preening politicians who populated her salon. She saw in him not a lover, but a lightning bolt, a force that could either destroy her or carry her to unimaginable heights. It was a gamble, but for a woman whose entire life was a gamble, it was one worth taking. The courtship that followed was a whirlwind, a collision of his volcanic passion and her pragmatic hesitation. Their marriage, in a Spartan civil ceremony on March 9th, 1796, was less a romantic union than a strategic merger. For Napoleon, it was a spectacular coup. By marrying the Vicomtesse de Beauharnais, the provincial soldier gained immediate access to the highest echelons of Parisian society. He acquired a patina of respectability and an influential partner who could navigate the political intrigues that baffled him. He was utterly, almost pathologically, in love, a fact made clear by the stream of scorching, desperate, and often pleading letters he sent her from the front lines of his first Italian campaign, which began just 2 days after their wedding. He wrote of his incomparable Josephine, his eternal love, begging for her to join him, complaining bitterly when her replies were slow or cool. His passion was a torrent, a force that sought to possess her completely. For Josephine, the calculation was different. She did not love him, not at first. She was fond of him, perhaps, and certainly impressed by his ferocious energy. But her primary motivation was security. She was marrying a man on the rise, a general with a future, a protector for herself and her children. While he was in Italy, conquering territory and writing her name in the annals of history, she remained in Paris, resuming her affair with a dashing young officer, Hippolyte Charles. Her infidelity was not born of malice, but of a fundamental misunderstanding of the man she had married. She saw him as another player in the game, not as the game-changer he was. She treated their marriage as a typical Directory-era arrangement of convenience, failing to grasp the all-consuming, possessive nature of his love. This initial dynamic, his burning obsession, and her detached pragmatism set the stage for all the drama that would follow. It was a union founded on a transaction, but one that would be forged into something far more complex in the crucible of war and power. While their personal drama unfolded, a much larger conflict raged across the continent, a struggle that formed the very context of their lives. The primary antagonist to Napoleon's ambition was not a single person, but a vast, sprawling, and implacable entity, the old monarchical order of Europe. This was a coalition of ancient dynasties, the Habsburgs of Austria, the Romanovs of Russia, the Hohenzollerns of Prussia, and, most relentlessly, the British monarchy, protected by the English Channel and powered by a burgeoning industrial economy and the world's most formidable navy. To these powers, Napoleon was not a legitimate sovereign. He was a usurper, a Corsican ogre, the monstrous offspring of the French Revolution, who threatened to export its dangerous ideas of meritocracy and nationalism across the continent. They saw his empire not as a new European order, but as a French-dominated tyranny that had to be destroyed. This fundamental ideological clash fueled more than 2 decades of near-constant warfare. A succession of 7 massive coalitions were formed against France, a testament to the existential threat Napoleon posed to the established powers. The battlefields of this epic struggle, Marengo, Austerlitz, Jena, Friedland, Wagram, were the milestones of Napoleon's ascent. Each victory against the forces of Austria or Prussia was not just a military triumph. It was a vindication of his revolutionary legitimacy and a personal victory over the crowned heads who despised his humble origins. This grand geopolitical struggle was the canvas upon which his relationship with Josephine was painted. His long absences on campaign created the very distance that allowed her initial infidelities. His victories brought them glory and an imperial crown. And ultimately, the relentless pressure of this continent-wide war, the constant need to secure his empire against these powerful and determined enemies, would be the very thing that forced him to confront the one fatal weakness in his dynastic plan: Josephine's inability to produce an heir. The antagonist was an entire world order, and its pressure would eventually crack the foundation of their marriage. The turning point, the moment the passionate lover began to transform into the hardened emperor, came not on a European battlefield, but under the searing sun of Egypt in 1798. Having conquered Italy, Napoleon launched an audacious and romantic campaign to seize Egypt, aiming to threaten British interests in India. He was physically isolated, thousands of miles from France, cut off by the British Navy after Nelson's decisive victory at the Battle of the Nile. It was in this state of isolation and frustration that the blow fell. His aides, perhaps encouraged by his jealous brothers, made sure he saw the Parisian gazettes and intercepted letters that detailed, in humiliating detail, Josephine's blatant and ongoing affair with the handsome lieutenant, Hippolyte Charles. The news shattered him. This was not merely infidelity, it was a profound, public humiliation. He, the conqueror of Italy, the hero of the Republic, was being made a cuckold in the salons of Paris for all the world to see. The chronicler Beauharnais, his private secretary, described a man utterly transformed by a terrible rage. The romantic, almost boyish passion that had filled his letters from Italy curdled into a bitter, cynical poison. It was a deep psychological break. He understood in that moment that his heart was a vulnerability, that his total devotion to Josephine gave her a power over him that could be used to wound him more deeply than any enemy army. He wrote a furious letter to his brother Joseph, declaring his intention to divorce her immediately upon his return. "The veil has been torn," he wrote, his love for her extinguished by betrayal. Though he would ultimately reconcile with her, thanks to a desperate, tearful appeal by her and her children, something was irrevocably broken. The unvarnished, unconditional love was gone, replaced by a more complex, guarded affection. He had learned a brutal lesson. To be an emperor, one could not afford the vulnerabilities of an ordinary man. This betrayal planted the first seed of the idea that his personal feelings and the interests of the state might not be one and the same. Despite the deep personal wound inflicted by her affair, Napoleon's return from Egypt was not the end of their partnership, but the beginning of its most critical phase. He arrived back in France in October of 1799 to find the Directory government collapsing under the weight of its own corruption and incompetence. The nation was ripe for a savior, a strong man who could restore order. A conspiracy was already in motion, led by figures like CAS and Napoleon's own brother, Lucien, to overthrow the government in a coup d'etat. While Napoleon provided the military might and the public prestige, Josephine played a subtle but absolutely vital role in the political maneuvering that preceded the coup of 18 Brumaire. It was here that she proved she was more than a faithless wife. She was an indispensable political asset. Her salon became the unofficial headquarters of the conspiracy. Using the vast social network she had painstakingly built over the years, she performed a delicate dance of influence and persuasion. She hosted dinners and receptions, inviting key politicians, bankers, and generals, allowing Napoleon to gauge their loyalties and win them over in a relaxed, non-confrontational setting. Her role was to be the soft, reassuring face of the coup. She charmed the wavering, calmed the fearful, and spread the narrative that her husband was not seeking to become a dictator, but was acting solely to save the Republic from itself. She famously entertained the director Gautier, one of the primary obstacles to the coup, at Malmaison on the very morning of the event, distracting him with her charm and preventing him from interfering. In the chaotic and uncertain days of the coup, when the political future of France hung in the balance, Josephine was the velvet glove on Napoleon's iron fist. She demonstrated her unique value to him, not as a lover, but as a partner in power. This collaboration rebuilt a part of their broken bond, transforming it into a political alliance. He saw that she was not just his lucky star, but a gifted operator who could manage the one battlefield he truly despised, the drawing rooms of Paris. The culmination of their shared journey, the absolute zenith of their power and glory, arrived on a bitterly cold day. December 2nd, 1804. The scene was the ancient cathedral of Notre Dame, redecorated from a temple of revolutionary reason back into a house of God for this singular event. The air was thick with the scent of cold stone, melting wax from thousands of candles, and the heavy incense that sought to sanctify a purely political act. Outside, the Parisian crowds cheered, a roar that was a mix of genuine adoration and state-managed enthusiasm. Inside, the entire elite of the new French Empire was assembled, marshals in their gaudy uniforms, ministers, and the Bonaparte clan, bristling with jealousy. This was to be their ultimate triumph. Pope Pius VII himself had been compelled to travel from Rome to officiate, a symbolic submission of the old spiritual power to the new temporal one. And then came the moment that would be immortalized by the painter Jacques-Louis David. Napoleon, who had risen from nothing, a man whose ambition was as vast as the continent itself, did not wait to be crowned. In an act of breathtaking arrogance and self-belief, he took the laurel wreath crown from the Pope's hands, turned his back on the altar, and placed it upon his own head. He was an emperor by his own will, not by the grace of God. But the most dramatic, the most personal, and the most revealing act was yet to come. He then picked up a smaller jeweled diadem. He turned to Josephine, who knelt before him, weeping with an emotion so overwhelming it was visible to all. He paused for a moment, looking at the woman who had been his partner in this incredible ascent, the widowed survivor, his lucky charm, his empress. Then, gently and with a visible tenderness, he placed the crown upon her head. In that single gesture, he elevated her with him. They were no longer merely a general and his wife. They were Napoleon and Josephine, emperor and empress, a new dynasty forged not from ancient bloodlines, but from the fires of revolution and the force of their shared ambition. It was the peak of their shared myth. At that moment of coronation, kneeling before him in Notre Dame, they were fused into a single, potent symbol. For Napoleon, this act was the culmination of a deeply held personal mythology. He was a man who, despite his rational mind, was profoundly superstitious. He believed in his star, in a destiny that had guided him through cannon fire and political conspiracies. And in his mind, Josephine was inextricably linked to that destiny. She had been with him at the beginning, when he was just an awkward, unknown general. Her social connections had aided his rise. Her presence by his side seemed to coincide with his greatest victories. Crowning her was not just an act of love, it was an act of faith in his own narrative. She was his talisman, the living embodiment of his good fortune. To crown her was to sanctify his own luck, to declare to the world that his ascent was not a political fluke, but a matter of fate. For Josephine, the weight of that diadem was the feeling of ultimate, unassailable security. The cold metal on her brow was a final, definitive barrier against the ghosts of her past. The penniless widow from Martinique, the terrified prisoner of Les Carmes, was now the Empress of the French, anointed in the most sacred cathedral in France, with the Pope as a witness. The roar of the crowd was a sound that banished the memory of the death carts. The power radiating from her husband was a shield that no enemy could penetrate. In this moment of shared hubris, they were perfectly united, not just as husband and wife, but as co-authors of an epic. They were two outsiders who had crashed the gates of history and seated themselves on a throne. Their joint triumph seemed to promise a future as brilliant and solid as the diamonds in their crowns, a shared destiny that appeared, for that one perfect moment, to be eternal. But even at this dazzling peak, a corrosive element was at work within the heart of the imperial court, a sworn enemy that schemed not on the battlefield, but in the corridors of the Tuileries palace itself. This enemy was Napoleon's own family, the Bonaparte clan, led by the formidable matriarch Letizia Ramolino, and fueled by the venomous ambition of Napoleon's sisters, Elisa, Pauline, and especially the cunning Caroline Murat. The Bonaparte formed a relentless anti-Josephine faction. They were a clannish, grasping Corsican family who saw themselves as the rightful heirs to the imperial fortune, and they viewed Josephine with a potent mixture of snobbery and contempt. To them, she was everything she should not be. She was la vieille, the old woman, 6 years Napoleon's senior. She was a de Beauharnais, a member of the old aristocracy they had fought to overthrow. She was a spendthrift whose extravagant debts infuriated them. Most unforgivably of all, she was a foreigner, a Creole who had, in their eyes, bewitched their brother and usurped the rightful place of a Bonaparte. But the true heart of their hatred, the weapon they wielded most effectively, was Josephine's barrenness. They whispered constantly in Napoleon's ear, reminding him that his magnificent empire, his grand dynasty, had no future. It rested on the life of one man, and would die with him because his wife could not produce an heir. Caroline, who had married the flamboyant Marshal Murat, was particularly vicious, seeing Josephine's infertility as the primary obstacle to her own ambitions for her children. They mocked her style, criticized her every move, and spread malicious rumors about her. This was not a political disagreement. It was a deeply personal, clan-based blood feud. Josephine was the outsider in their family, and they were a constant, dripping poison in Napoleon's ear, relentlessly eroding the foundation of his marriage by framing his love for his wife as a fatal weakness, a sentimental indulgence that threatened the very future of the empire he had built. While the Bonaparte clan schemed against her, Josephine carved out her own domain of influence, a realm of soft power that would do as much to define the Napoleonic era as her husband's legal codes and military victories. If Napoleon gave the empire its laws and its borders, Josephine gave it its style. Her personal court at the Château de Malmaison, the country estate she purchased and lavishly renovated, became the cultural heart of the new regime. It was here that she asserted her authority, not as a political strategist, but as the supreme arbiter of taste. She single-handedly created the Empire style, a neoclassical aesthetic that blended Roman grandeur with a new, streamlined elegance. She patronized architects like Percier and Fontaine, furniture makers like Jacob de Malter, and fashion designers like Louis Hippolyte Leroy, who, under her direction, replaced the corsets and panniers of the old regime with high-waisted flowing gowns inspired by Greco-Roman statuary. This was more than just fashion. It was a political statement. The style she championed was a visual break with the Bourbon past, a look for a new, modern, and powerful France. Malmaison itself became a showcase for this new aesthetic and for Josephine's other great passion, botany. She created one of the most magnificent gardens in Europe, filled with exotic plants from around the world, including the first successful cultivation of black swans outside of Australia and hundreds of new species of roses. Her patronage of botanical illustrators like Pierre-Joseph Redoute produced some of the finest botanical art in history. In this, she was not merely indulging a hobby. She was participating in the scientific and cultural prestige of the empire. Malmaison was her kingdom, a place where she could construct a world of beauty and order, a stark contrast to the brutal, chaotic world of politics and war inhabited by her husband. It was a domain of influence that he could not control, but which he deeply respected, for he understood that she was helping to build the cultural legacy that would outlast his conquests. The complexity of their relationship was deepened by the presence of Josephine's children from her first marriage, Eugène and Hortense de Beauharnais. In a court filled with the grasping and often incompetent members of his own family, Napoleon found in his stepchildren a loyalty and competence that he cherished. He came to genuinely love them as his own, a paternal affection that formed a powerful, unspoken bond with Josephine. He saw in Eugène a model son, brave, loyal, and a capable military commander. Napoleon formally adopted him, made him a viceroy of Italy and a prince of the empire, and relied on him as one of his most trusted subordinates. He arranged a prestigious marriage for Eugène to Princess Augusta of Bavaria, cementing his place within European royalty. Similarly, he doted on Hortense, a graceful and artistic young woman. He married her to his own sullen and difficult brother, Louis Bonaparte, and made them the King and Queen of Holland. This union was politically motivated and personally unhappy, but it produced a son, Napoleon Charles, whom Napoleon adored and, for a time, considered making his official heir. This deep affection for Eugène and Hortense was a constant, tangible link to Josephine. They were a shared family, a ready-made dynasty that connected them on a level far deeper than mere passion. However, this very love created an agonizing paradox. The presence of these beloved stepchildren, and especially the birth of his nephew and potential heir, threw into stark relief the one thing his own union with Josephine lacked. Every honor he bestowed upon Eugène, every loving glance he gave to little Napoleon Charles, was a silent testament to the biological void at the center of his own marriage. The family he had built with Josephine was both a source of immense personal comfort and a painful, constant reminder of her one great failure, a failure that the politics of empire would not allow him to ignore forever. The whispers of the Bonaparte clan and the cold logic of dynastic politics began to gather like storm clouds on the horizon. The question of succession, once a private anxiety, evolved into a pressing matter of state. The French Empire, for all its military glory, rested on the life of a single man. Assassination attempts were a constant threat, and every time Napoleon faced enemy fire on the battlefield, the entire political structure of France held its breath. Ministers like the cunning diplomat Talleyrand and the ruthless police chief Fouché began to relentlessly pressure the emperor. They argued that for the empire to survive him, to become a lasting institution rather than a temporary military dictatorship, he needed a direct biological heir. A son would solidify the new Bonaparte dynasty, ensure a peaceful succession, and provide the ultimate guarantee against a return of the Bourbons. The pressure was immense and multifaceted. It was political, coming from his most senior advisors. It was familial, coming from his ever-scheming siblings. And it was becoming personal. To silence the rumors that he himself might be sterile, Napoleon began to take mistresses. His brief affair with a young woman named Éléonore de Noël de la Plagne resulted in the birth of a son in 1806. This event, though the child's paternity was never fully certain in his mind, was a devastating blow to Josephine. It served as a cruel proof that he could father children, shifting the burden of their childlessness squarely onto her shoulders. An atmosphere of impending doom began to settle around the empress. Every state dinner, every public ceremony, was an unspoken reminder of her inadequacy. She saw the calculating looks from the ministers, felt the triumphant stares of her sisters-in-law. The secure world she had built for herself was beginning to fracture, threatened not by an invading army, but by the quiet, inexorable ticking of a biological clock and the brutal demands of a dynastic state. The decision, when it finally came, was the most agonizing of Napoleon's life, an act of political surgery on his own heart. For years he had resisted the relentless pressure, torn between his genuine love for Josephine and the cold, unassailable logic of his advisors. The final impetus came after the victorious Wagram campaign in 1809. He had once again defeated the Austrians, expanded his empire to its greatest extent, and now, at the absolute peak of his power, the question of what would come next became paramount. He concluded that his creation, the grand edifice of the French Empire, was more important than his personal happiness. It was his legacy, his life's work, and it was fragile. To make it permanent, to weave it into the fabric of European history, it needed a future. It needed an heir, born of his body, and ideally, of a union with one of the ancient royal houses of Europe. This would both solve the succession crisis and grant his revolutionary dynasty the one thing it lacked: old world legitimacy. The psychology of this era, if love can call it such, was that of a creator sacrificing his dearest possession for the sake of his creation. It was not an act of falling out of love. All evidence suggests he loved her as deeply as ever. It was a brutal calculation, a decision made by the emperor, not the man. He convinced himself that this was a shared sacrifice for the good of France. He would give up the woman he loved, and she would give up her crown, all for the sake of the empire they had built together. He was a man accustomed to bending the world to his will, and he believed he could control this too. He thought he could excise Josephine from her official role while keeping her in his life, compartmentalizing his heart away from the duties of his throne. It was the ultimate act of imperial hubris, the belief that even the laws of love and loss would bend to his command. The final act of their imperial partnership was not a scene of political maneuvering, but of pure, unadulterated human heartbreak. On the evening of December 15th, 1809, in the glittering throne room of the Tuileries Palace, the imperial court assembled for a ceremony of unprecedented and painful solemnity. The room was unnaturally quiet, the usual courtly chatter replaced by a tense, somber silence. Napoleon, dressed in full imperial regalia, stood pale and resolute, his face a mask of controlled anguish. Josephine, supported by her daughter Hortense, was so overcome with grief she could barely stand. Her face, behind a delicate veil, was awash with tears. This was the scene of their divorce. It was a public ritual designed to give the separation the force of law and to frame it as a mutual sacrifice for the good of the nation. An arch-chancellor read a formal statement. Then it was Napoleon's turn. In a voice thick with emotion, he read from a prepared text, speaking of his love for his dearly beloved wife and the political necessity that sacrifices the dearest affections of my heart. When it was Josephine's turn, she tried to read her own statement, which echoed his sentiments of sacrifice, but her voice broke after the first few words. She choked on a sob and collapsed, unable to continue. She handed the paper to an official, who read it for her while she wept uncontrollably. The spectacle was excruciating for all who witnessed it. The emperor, the man who never flinched before cannon fire, who could dictate terms to kings and czars, was visibly weeping, his imperial composure utterly shattered. He had conquered a continent, but was being defeated by his own heart. When the ceremony was over, he took her hand and led her to her apartments, where he reportedly embraced her one last time before she left the palace forever. This was their greatest catastrophe, not a military defeat, but a profound moral and emotional one. The all-powerful emperor had uncrowned his empress, and in doing so, had inflicted a wound upon himself that would never truly heal. Even after the formal separation and his subsequent marriage to the young Austrian Archduchess Marie-Louise, Napoleon found it impossible to truly sever the bond with Josephine. Their story did not end with the divorce. It simply entered a new, poignant chapter. Josephine retired to her beloved Malmaison, retaining her title of Empress, a generous income, and the respect of the nation. But she was now a queen in exile, removed from the center of power. Napoleon, meanwhile, got what he wanted. His new wife quickly produced a son and heir, Napoleon Francois Charles Joseph, titled the King of Rome. The dynasty was secure, yet the emperor seemed haunted. He wrote to Josephine constantly, his letters filled with a strange mixture of affection, concern for her health, and obsessive complaints about her ever-mounting debts. He demanded daily updates from Malmaison, consulted her on matters of court etiquette, and valued her opinion above all others. He would secretly visit her, and their meetings were filled with a familiar intimacy that belied their separation. His marriage to Marie-Louise was a cold, formal, political affair. She was a dutiful wife and mother, but there was no spark, no shared history, no true partnership. The courtiers whispered that the emperor was often melancholic, lost in thought. He began to see every misfortune, every political setback, as a form of divine retribution for having abandoned his lucky star. The disastrous Russian campaign of 1812, the subsequent collapse of his German allies, the slow, agonizing defeat of his empire. In his more superstitious moments, he linked all of it back to the moment he had cast Josephine aside. It was as if by divorcing her, he had broken his pact with destiny. His last chance was a desperate attempt to hold on to both his empire and his connection to her. But the two had become mutually exclusive. By choosing the empire, he had, in his own mind, damned it. Life after Josephine was a life of diminishing returns, a long, slow slide from the summit he had shared only with her. The final act of Josephine's life played out like a scene from a tragic opera, her personal fate intertwined with the grand collapse of the Napoleonic dream. In the spring of 1814, the unthinkable happened. The allied armies of Russia, Prussia, and Austria entered Paris. Napoleon, defeated by a coalition of all of Europe, was forced to abdicate. He was exiled to the small Mediterranean island of Elba, a mock kingdom for a fallen emperor. While he was away, Josephine remained at Malmaison, a figure of immense curiosity and respect. The victors, including Tsar Alexander I of Russia, were fascinated by her. The Tsar, in particular, was charmed by her grace and intelligence, becoming a frequent visitor to her home. He offered her his protection, ensuring the security of her and her children in the new Bourbon-run France. It was a final, ironic twist. Her famous charm had captivated even her husband's conqueror, but her health was failing. In late May, after hosting the Tsar for a walk in the famously damp gardens of Malmaison, she caught a severe cold. It quickly developed into what was likely pneumonia. Her condition deteriorated rapidly. As she lay dying, her mind, like Napoleon's would 7 years later, turned to the central figures of her life. According to the memoirs of her lady-in-waiting, her final whispered words were a haunting, disconnected trilogy of her greatest love and her greatest sorrow. Bonaparte, Elba, the King of Rome. She died on May 29, 1814, at the age of 50. The news reached Napoleon on Elba weeks later, and he was reportedly devastated, locking himself away for 2 days, refusing to see anyone. His lucky star had been extinguished, and a part of him died with her on an island of exile, while the woman who had shared his throne was being mourned by his conquerors. Her death cemented her place in history, but it did not simplify her legacy. Instead, Josephine exists as a fascinating conflict of interpretations, a woman viewed through the powerful, distorting lens of Napoleon's own legend. To his detractors, and to a certain school of cynical historians, she was little more than a beautiful, frivolous, and ultimately tragic footnote. In this interpretation, she is the Creole courtesan, the master of seduction who was in the right place at the right time. She is defined by her extravagance, her infidelity, her political lightweightedness, and her ultimate failure to produce an heir. She was a charming but disposable stepping stone on Napoleon's path to greatness, a starter wife whom he cast aside as soon as a more suitable, royally bred broodmare became available. She was a decorative element of the empire, not a foundational one. But there is a second, more romantic and psychologically compelling interpretation, one that Napoleon himself seemed to endorse in his writings from St. Helena. In this view, Josephine was the great love of his life, his muse, and his indispensable partner. She was the humanizing force in an era of brutal ambition. She taught the awkward soldier how to navigate society, provided the grace to his brute force, and was the only person who truly understood the man behind the imperial mask. She was his talisman, his étoile, and his decision to divorce her was the fatal act of hubris from which his fortunes never recovered. In this narrative, she is not a footnote, but the emotional core of the entire Napoleonic epic, the secret key to understanding the emperor's heart. Her legacy, therefore, is not her own. It is a mirror reflecting what one chooses to see in Napoleon, either the cold, calculating strategist who used and discarded people, or the passionate romantic who sacrificed his own happiness for a dream of glory and was forever haunted by the cost. So we return to the core question, the paradox that hangs over the storm-swept rock of St. Helena. Why? Why could the man who rejected her never forget her? The answer is not simple, for it is woven from the very fabric of his identity. Napoleon could not forget Josephine because she was inseparable from the most vital and miraculous part of his own story, his ascent. She was not just a witness to his transformation, She was a co-creator of it. He met her when he was a nobody, a hungry and socially awkward general with a funny accent and a grand destiny only he could see. She was his entry into the world of power, his guide to the labyrinthine politics of Paris. His love for her was the great, soaring passion of his youth, unburdened by the cynicism of empire. Every step of his climb, from general to first consul to emperor, was taken with her by his side. She was the face in the crowd at his triumphs, the reassuring presence in the palace after his battles. Therefore, to remember her was to remember himself at his most potent, his most hopeful, his most alive. Rejecting her for dynastic reasons was a logical act, but it was also a betrayal of his own myth. In his superstitious mind, divorcing Josephine was divorcing the very fate, the lucky star, that had made him Napoleon. His second wife, Marie-Louise, gave him an heir and a royal connection, but she could never give him what Josephine had, a shared past. Marie-Louise had married an emperor. Josephine had married a man and helped him become one. Forgetting Josephine would have meant erasing the very foundation of his own legend, and for a man as obsessed with his place in history as Napoleon, that was an impossible act. She represented not just a woman he had loved, but the very magic of his own improbable rise to power. Ultimately, the grand saga of Napoleon and Josephine transcends the story of two individuals and becomes a timeless, universal lesson on the eternal conflict between the heart and the crown, between personal love and the impersonal demands of power. Their relationship is a stark illustration of the principle that what is politically necessary is often personally catastrophic. Napoleon's empire was a rational project, a modern state built on laws, bureaucracy, and military might. To ensure its survival, he made a rational choice. He needed an heir, and therefore he needed a new wife. It was a decision any monarch in history would have understood and applauded. And yet, this act of supreme reason led directly to his emotional unraveling. It demonstrates that even the most powerful and disciplined of leaders, a man who could command the lives of millions and redraw the borders of nations, can be utterly powerless against the illogical, irrational, and unbreakable bonds of the human heart. Their story serves as the ultimate verdict on the limits of ambition. Napoleon gained his heir and the legitimacy he craved, but he lost his talisman, and in his own mind, his luck. It suggests that some victories come at too high a price, and that the foundations of an empire are no stronger than the emotional stability of the man who rules it. Their love was the one territory he conquered in his youth that he could never successfully govern with the cold logic of his later years. It remained a wild, untamable part of his inner landscape, a constant reminder of a time when he was more than just an emperor. He was a man deeply and recklessly in love. The final frame is not the gilded throne room of the Tuileries or the blood-soaked field of Waterloo. It is a small, damp room on the most remote island imaginable. The wind howls outside, a lonely, desolate sound. An emperor lies dying, stripped of his crown, his armies, his son, his wife, and the empire that was his life's work. He is a prisoner of the British, a historical artifact, cataloging his own memories for a posterity he hopes will be kind. In these final, fevered moments, his mind does not dwell on the articles of the Napoleonic Code, the strategy at Austerlitz, or the political betrayals that led him here. His mind and his soul travel back in time, past the years of glory and conquest, past the pomp and the ceremony, back to a woman he had chosen, crowned, and then discarded. A woman whose memory has proven more durable than any treaty he ever signed, more potent than any army he ever led. The last word he utters is not a command, nor a curse, nor a prayer. It is simply a name. Josephine. This whisper is not the sound of an emperor's defeat. It is the final, irrefutable evidence of a man's eternal love, a testament to the one part of his life that remained unconquered, the one bond that proved stronger, more resilient, and ultimately more meaningful than any empire ever built. Of stone, steel, and blood.